Hello everybody. In this lesson I will provide an overview of language teaching methodology. First and foremost, it is important to emphasize that language teaching methodology answers teachers' two most important questions. Number one, what to teach, and number two, how to teach it. Here's a very basic and simple definition of methodology by Hall. So methodology is, according to this author, what practicing teachers actually do in the classroom to achieve their stated or unstated teaching objectives. In order to understand the dimensions of a method, it is very useful to consider this framework by Riches and Rogers. So according to them, method contains an approach, which is a theory of language and a theory of language learning, and then these principles are used to design specific roles for the teacher, the students, the kind of materials, and so on. And finally, the procedures establish specific activities and exercises to practice the language. Concerning the approach, every method is going to be based on a different theory of language. So for some methods, language consists of a series of lexical items and grammatical structures. For some others, a list of communicative functions or skills or tasks. Concerning the theory of language learning, in the same way, some methods will support a view that language is best learned by repetition and imitation. This is a behaviorist point of view. For some others, the theory will be mentalist or cognitivist, that we learn the language by analyzing the rules of the grammar. And for some others, we learn language by interacting with other people. And so these two theories are going to answer our basic questions. What is language, and how do people learn languages, so that we know how we must teach it to be as effective as possible. Now, in terms of the design, once we have the theories, we establish the role of the teacher, the role of the learners, the types of interactions that there are going to be between and among learners, the skills and sub-skills that are going to be taught, the nature and the kinds of materials that are going to be used for the lessons, the role of the native language, whether it's going to be used in class or completely banned, if we're going to correct the grammar errors or not, and how, and obviously whether or not there will be information about the culture of the target language. And obviously we also need to consider the evaluation. Are we going to assess learners' outcomes or not? Now, in terms of the procedure, this is very simple, right? Because in this case, we establish the activities or exercises that the students are going to use to practice, and the specific techniques that the teacher is going to use to teach the language. Now, let's remember some of the most important language teaching methods and approaches, so that we can remember what each of these methods advocates and how they are implemented in the classroom. So some of them, of course, this is just like a limited list: Suggestopedia, content-based instruction, or content and language integrated learning, the participatory approach, the audiolingual method, community language learning, the natural approach, the task-based approach, the silent way, the direct method, total physical response, competency-based language teaching, programmed learning, communicative language teaching, and the lexical approach. So we're going to review them, and we're going to see what each method does. Now, in the first method that we're going to describe, learners focus on chunks of language, such as common collocations and phrases, instead of just studying isolated words. Of course, we are talking about the lexical approach, which is the method in which students translate sentences between their native language and the target language, focusing mainly on accuracy, and then work out the grammar rules and use, grammar exercises to practice the language. Of course, in this case, we're talking about grammar translation. In yet another method, we use role-playing activities to encourage students, to use the language in meaningful interactions, and obviously we focus on functional language. and we help the students to use the language in real life situations. This is obviously communicative language teaching. In this next method, learners practice repetitive drills and dialogues to reinforce correct sentence structure. So it's drilling until the grammatical structures become automatic, and we're obviously talking about the audiolingual method. Now, in this other approach, learners complete real-world tasks like planning a trip or ordering food to develop communication skills. Now, this method obviously involves giving students tasks that require using the target language to complete. So we're talking obviously about task-based language teaching. Here's another modern way of learning a language, and this is, by working through structured sequences of exercises and receiving immediate feedback after each step. So we work with self-paced digital quizzes where we answer multiple choice questions and then get instant correction before moving to the next level. Of course, we're talking here about program learning, which is done by means of different platforms and applications. Now, in another method, the teachers use only the target language, often incorporating real-life objects and visuals to teach vocabulary and grammar. So here, obviously, we're talking about the direct method. There are obviously some other methods that do the same thing, but the direct method was the first one in which they established that the first language should be banned from the classroom so that the learners can establish direct connection between the words and the meanings in the target language. In the next method, the teacher remains mostly silent, and they will use gestures and visual aids to prompt the student response. So the most important thing is to encourage students to discover the language rules on their own instead of teaching them. So the learner should work out the rules by themselves. Of course, we're talking about the silent way. In the next method, the teacher uses positive suggestion and a very relaxed classroom atmosphere so that the learner's psychological barriers can be lowered. So this method incorporates, soothing classical music, dramatized readings, and comfortable settings to create this enjoyable learning experience in which the learners can learn without any kind of stress. Usually, the students will take on new identities in the target language. This method is obviously Suggestopedia. Another method. This one combines language learning with physical movement. The students are going to respond to commands that require physical actions, and this is thought to help to reinforce vocabulary and grammatical structures. This is obviously total physical response. Now, in some approaches, the students learn a subject, history or science, through the medium of a foreign language. This means that they learn content at the same time as they learn the language. And here we're talking obviously about content-based instruction or content and language integrated learning. This is one of the most effective methods because you connect directly the language to specific content so that learning can become more. There is another method developed by Charles Curran in which the students sit in a circle and engage in a conversation in their native language. The teacher, acting as a counselor, is going to translate their ideas into the target language, and later the students will analyze the conversation and reflect on the learning process. This is called community language learning. In this approach, the students acquire language naturally through exposure to input and meaningful communication. For example, a storytelling session where learners listen to a narrative and respond to comprehension questions, all of this without any explicit grammar instruction. This is obviously the natural approach, comprehensible inputs. In this approach, students engage in problem-solving discussions based on real-life, usually social issues. For example, they could work on a community-based project and then will identify a local challenge, they will brainstorm for solutions, and finally they will collaborate to create a written proposal or presentation in the target language. This approach is based on the pedagogy of the oppressed by Paulo Freire, and we call it the participatory approach. Finally, there's an approach that focuses on specific measurable competencies that learners need to function effectively in a professional or a social context. Now, this approach is structured around practical skills such as writing a formal email or conducting a business negotiation. In other words, the objective is to enable learners to become competent at some real activities using the language that they will need in a real life context. And this approach is called competency-based language teaching. So this was a little overview of language teaching methodology, and we have seen what methodology is, what a method comprises, and finally we have taken a little overview of some of the most common language teaching methods or approaches. Thanks a lot for your attention, and see you next time.